Unified augmentation language is useful for naming and referencing very specific dimensions of experience. The reason you might want to do this is to be able to bring them into a common frame and compare them across perspectives. On one hand, you might add the objective elements, or the things that you can commonly experience together, and on the other side, you might bring subjective elements, or the things that are only experienced by one person. This really depends on the context that this is brought up, because even representing which experiences are viewed as objective or subjective can sometimes cause miscommunications to arise. We can draw this out with an abstract drawing and say that the things that you have in a speech bubble might be shared across people because they can recognize what was literally said, and the things that are in the thought bubble might be things that are only subjective because people can't read each other's minds. Then we can also say what was heard is somewhere in between because it's partially subjective and partially objective. An example of where this might be useful outside of the context of communicating between people is that you can communicate what exists on differently colored squares. You might say on the blue squares it's more appropriate to represent images that have blue ink, and on the purple squares it's more appropriate to represent images that have purple ink. Unified augmentation language gives you a structure to be able to say these squares have blue ink and these squares have purple ink. There are ways to make that more complicated by identifying which elements of those statements are objectively true versus subjectively true, but the main thing that we would want to note is that their appearance is blue or purple. So all we would need to represent is in square brackets, these squares are blue, and then in a different pair of square brackets, these squares are purple. Then we have the option of associating the label of purple to the bracket or to the contents of those brackets. But again, that gets into very complicated territory depending on who you're talking to and the willingness to find common ground. The example of this toward synchronicity is making a 4-part statement where you iterate through the context, the focal point, the appearance, and the reality. For example, outside, park bench, painted, and wet is the context. From this, there is an essence that is projected onto the concept of wetness that includes being painted onto a park bench outside. So we can use that context to interpret that we're probably talking about wet paint because we're mentioning a park bench that's painted. Although it would be reasonable for us to associate wetness with rain because we have also mentioned that this is outside.